Hello, Christian. Non-U.S. central banks have begun cutting interest rates, while it appears likely that the U.S. Federal Reserve will wait for some time. Can you talk about the market implications of this? Are we already priced in, or in your view, are there still dynamics to be played out across asset classes?
We may be at a bit of a pivotal moment in time right now, with central banks around the world having started to cut interest rates, as their domestic economies have improved from an inflation perspective. I'm thinking about Switzerland, Sweden, Canada, and most recently, of course, the ECB that cut rates from what was a record high of about 4%. Now, moving to the US, nominal growth in the US remains quite high relative to potential growth in the economy. And that has at least been partially driven by fiscal deficits that stimulate the economy during a time of low unemployment, which is quite unusual, and I do wonder about the sustainability of that situation. And that strong nominal growth is of course at odds with the Fed's mandate of bringing inflation back to 2%. That's the reason why we've seen rate cuts being pushed out further and further as the year has progressed, which is something we have talked about in the past. With that backdrop, we're at an interesting moment in time, because on the one hand, we're in this feel-good environment where market participants are quite bullish. Stocks keep grinding higher, stock market keeps making new record highs, and valuations are already quite stretched. The risk premia and credit spreads have compressed, and the implied volatility in the market today is very modest. So to summarize, the picture that emerges is one that I wouldn't exactly characterize as caution or cautious. On the other hand, we are now in an environment where the federal funds rate is above payroll growth, where the unemployment rate has ticked up from the low 3s to 4% today, and where the excess savings accumulated during the pandemic have largely been exhausted. The savings rate today is at 3.2%. That's below its historical average. And credit card delinquencies have slowly started to pick up. So when I just look at the data, there's a different picture that emerges, one where the hot air might be slowly coming out of the balloon. And if the environment is indeed changing, we haven't seen that reflected in the valuations of US equities or the US dollar, which continues to trade quite dearly relative to most other major currencies.
You mentioned growth numbers. In the United States, we've seen growth decelerating, but still remaining positive. How is that translating to the fundamental picture in terms of the companies you cover in the United States and outside the United States?
I have just returned from a research trip to Asia, and I can report back that the business environment in Asia, ex-China, is very conducive today. This is partially driven by a rebound in post-pandemic tourism. Now, when it comes to China, when I met with these Asian companies and they spoke about their Chinese operations, their Chinese subsidiaries, it's picking up a little bit, but China remains quite slow and the Chinese consumer remains very cautious. Which brings me to the US, because we've seen a bit of a trend emerge in the US. Our companies that have exposure to the US consumer, when I look at them, the ones that have fared quite well recently, those are the ones that cater to consumers with low-cost products, low-cost services. On the other hand, the ones that cater towards more discretionary purchases, they have struggled a bit. And intuitively, that makes sense because it's consistent with the narrative that the excess savings of the pandemic have been exhausted. But of course, the US economy is largely driven by consumption. Consumption makes up almost 70% of GDP. So with the composition of consumer spending changing, shifting, this is something we monitor very carefully at First Eagle.
Thank you very much for your thoughts today. Look forward to speaking to you next month.
Thank you.